The land had always been quiet, 40 acres of open fields, fenced boundaries, and a long gravel road that cut through the property like a slow-moving river. It was the kind of place where the silence felt earned, where the wind carried nothing but the smell of grass and old soil. For years, the property had been my refuge from the noise and nonsense of nearby neighborhoods, especially the HOA-controlled developments that had begun creeping closer every year. Their rules, inspections, petty fines, and constant surveillance were everything I moved out there to escape. Yet even with the distance, their influence had a way of spilling past their borders. It began early on a Saturday morning. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, and the sky was still a dull gray when the rumbling reached my window. At first, it sounded like thunder, low and heavy, rolling across the field. But the vibration didn't fade like a storm would. It grew stronger, sharper, and unmistakably mechanical. By the time I stepped outside onto the porch, the truth was staring at me from the end of the dirt road. One large party bus. Then another. And then a third. 3 full-sized buses, painted in neon colors, decked out with rooftop lights, and blasting muffled bass from inside, slowly crawled their way onto my property like some ridiculous parade that had lost its route. The engines roared as they rolled down the road I maintained and paid for, their tires sinking into the soft dirt and leaving deep ruts behind them. I watched, frozen in disbelief, as all 3 buses drove straight past the private property, no entry signs without even slowing down. They were heading toward the open field near the old barn, the place the HOA had complained about endlessly because they claimed it interrupted the scenic view from the new luxury homes they had built along the ridge. Their newsletter had mentioned something about community events, special gatherings, and attempts to coordinate with nearby landowners. None of which had involved actually speaking to me. And now, apparently, they had decided my land would make the perfect overflow parking lot for whatever big event they were hosting. By the time the buses parked in a messy row, doors swinging open and people beginning to spill out, I already felt the simmering frustration that came with dealing with HOA arrogance. It wasn't the first time they had acted like my land was their playground. It was only the first time they had done it with vehicles the size of small houses. The passengers, well-dressed, loud, and clearly in weekend party mode, had no hesitation stepping onto my grass, wandering around as if they had purchased tickets to my property. Some took pictures. Others wandered toward my barn. A few tried to climb the wooden fence to look at the grazing field beyond it. The HOA might have orchestrated this chaos, but the people they brought didn't care one bit about where they were. They were excited, distracted, and fully convinced they were allowed to be there. I stayed hidden for a moment, watching the scene unfold. My mind wasn't running on rage yet, it was running on calculation. Trespassing, property damage, unauthorized commercial use, each problem added itself to a mental list that grew longer with every passing minute. The HOA had stepped over boundaries before, but nothing like this. Nothing this bold. Nothing this illegal. The buses kept idling for a while, engines humming loudly and producing thick exhaust that drifted into the air. The smell hit the soil before long. I walked quietly toward the entrance gate and examined the tire marks. Fresh. Deep. Easily documentable. I took pictures of everything, the signs they ignored, the condition of the road before and after, the footprints, the buses, the wandering guests. Evidence wasn't just useful, it was priceless whenever the HOA tried to twist reality. As the sun finally pushed over the horizon, the true size of the intrusion became clear. The field looked like a temporary concert venue. The HOA had apparently chosen my land as a staging area for their massive community festival, an event they had been bragging about for weeks. It was supposed to attract hundreds of households, and the HOA president had boasted in local ads about transportation being fully provided. Now I knew what that meant. They were using my land to park their buses, shuttle their guests, and manage overflow. And they had never asked. Not even once. By mid-morning, another group approached from the ridge, the HOA volunteers. They wore matching shirts, badges, and the self-important expressions of people who believed rules applied only to others. They were setting up tables on the edge of my property, as if they were preparing to turn the field into an official check-in station. Their confidence in trespassing suggested one thing very clearly: they thought I wouldn't fight them. Or worse, they thought I wouldn't even notice. But they forgot one small, inconvenient fact. The property had one entrance. One large metal gate. And that gate locked from the outside. I walked back toward it with slow, deliberate steps. The buses were parked deep enough into my land that they had no easy way out except through that same entrance. The idea formed in my mind so cleanly, so perfectly, that it almost felt like justice writing itself. If the HOA wanted to use my land, they were going to pay for it. Literally. I reached the gate, swung it shut, and slid the heavy chain through the metal loops. The lock clicked loudly, echoing across the field like a final verdict. The only road in and out was now closed, and the buses, along with every volunteer and early guest, were officially stuck on private property. The moment I turned the key, a strange calm washed over me. Not anger. Not hesitation. Just a quiet satisfaction that the situation had finally shifted back into my control. Now they weren't trespassers wandering freely. Now they were occupants who needed permission to leave. And permission had a price. The HOA had brought the problem onto my land. Now they were all going to learn what trespassing really cost. The moment the lock snapped shut, the atmosphere on the field changed. At first, no one noticed. The party volunteers were too absorbed in unfolding tables, dragging boxes, and trying to arrange signs that kept falling over in the morning breeze. The passengers who had stepped off the buses were still milling around, laughing, stretching, and taking pictures as if this were the start of some weekend getaway. None of them knew the situation had shifted from harmless trespass to something far more controlled, far more intentional. But slowly, inevitably, the realization began to creep in. One of the bus drivers, a tired-looking man with a coffee cup balanced on the dashboard, finally stepped out to stretch his legs. He walked toward the gate, likely intending to reposition the bus for the next round of passengers. He stopped abruptly when he saw the chain, the lock, and the firmly shut entrance. His confusion was instant, visible even from a distance. He tugged at the gate once, then twice, and then stared down at the chain like it was an alien object that had materialized without warning. Within minutes, the other drivers joined him. Their voices blended into urgent tones. They pointed at the gate, gestured at the buses, and then scanned the field as if expecting someone to appear with an explanation. The volunteers noticed the commotion next. They abandoned their setup, swarming toward the entrance with raised clipboards and half-filled paperwork, clearly unprepared for anything that did not follow their script. From my vantage point on the hill near the barn, I watched the chaos unfold with a level of calm I rarely enjoyed when dealing with the HOA. The power dynamic had shifted, and everyone down there could feel it. The buses were no longer a symbol of HOA control or community pride, they were liabilities trapped inside private property, and the HOA volunteers knew it. Their movements were faster, more frantic, and their once organized group had turned into a cluster of uncertainty. They checked their phones, paced in circles, and scanned the field looking for anyone who might help them understand what had happened. But the land was wide, open, and quiet. The only person who had the answers wasn't rushing to meet them. I wanted the discomfort to sink in. I wanted them to feel the weight of what they had done by assuming they could commandeer someone else's property without permission. Trespassing was not a small misstep. It was a violation, one the HOA had made repeatedly. This time, however, they had left behind something far more valuable than tire marks or broken fences. They had left behind assets. 3 buses. 3 drivers. And nearly a dozen volunteers. The festival, which they had spent weeks advertising, depended heavily on those buses for transportation. Without them, the event would collapse into chaos long before it could properly begin. And every wasted minute on my land was another reminder that they had no legal right to be there. Before long, one of the HOA volunteers marched toward the ridge, likely attempting to get a cell signal strong enough to reach the HOA president or board members. Another volunteer walked toward the buses, gathering all the drivers to discuss backup plans. Panic hovered over the group like an invisible fog. The realization was dawning quickly: the HOA had miscalculated, and they were now at the mercy of the landowner they had repeatedly antagonized. I walked down the hill slowly, taking my time. The volunteers spotted me before I reached them. A wave of desperate relief washed over their faces, as if the arrival of a single person might magically resolve everything. They approached with hurried steps, waving hands, frantic explanations, and urgent gestures toward the locked gate, but I didn't stop walking. I continued past them until I reached the exact spot where the buses had dug deep ruts into the dirt, ruining the road I maintained year after year. I took more photos. Close-ups this time, documenting every inch of damage. The ground was torn up, soft soil thrown aside, and fresh imprints embedded deep into the path. The repair wouldn't be cheap. But now, the bill wouldn't be mine to pay. The volunteers crowded behind me, their presence buzzing with frantic energy. Their attempts to get my attention grew more desperate, their hand motions larger, their expressions more strained. But I remained focused on documenting the scene. Evidence first. Everything else second. Soon, the HOA president appeared at the far end of the ridge, panting slightly as she walked down the dirt slope in a blazer entirely unsuited for the uneven terrain. She had probably rushed out the moment she heard the news. Her presence marked the shift from confusion to confrontation. She scanned the area, saw the locked gate, the buses, the volunteers, and finally me standing calmly in the middle of the disrupted field. Her expression tightened into a mix of frustration and forced composure, the look of someone accustomed to authority but now facing a situation entirely outside her control. I didn't need her words. I didn't need her explanations. Her presence alone told me everything. The HOA hadn't asked because they assumed they didn't have to. They believed they had the right to use the land however they pleased, whenever they pleased. They believed I wouldn't fight back. But now, with their entire transportation fleet trapped, their festival minutes from failure, and their volunteers stranded, the arrogance had finally met its limits. I walked past her without stopping, heading straight for the gate. I checked the lock again, ensuring it was tight, firm, and secure. Then I returned to the field center, where all the volunteers and drivers waited. The president followed, her steps sharp and impatient. The tension cradled the entire landscape. Everyone knew the only way out was a conversation, one where the HOA would finally understand that there were consequences for trespassing. But I wasn't interested in heated arguments or emotional scenes. I was interested in one thing only: accountability. And accountability had a process. I took my time surveying the area, noting every piece of equipment they had brought onto my land. Tables, boxes, banners, supplies, they had set up a full operation without a single trace of consent. Everything they brought, everything they planned, and everything they assumed was legal now sat in a gray zone created entirely by their own actions. The HOA president stood nearby, clearly expecting negotiation or compromise. Instead, what she witnessed was careful, methodical assessment. I wanted her to see that this was no impulsive reaction. It was deliberate. Measured. Justified. When I finally turned my back to head toward the farmhouse, leaving them stranded on the land they invaded, the weight of the situation settled on every face in the field. Panic, frustration, and quiet dread radiated through the group. They weren't leaving until the matter was settled. The gate stayed locked. And the HOA was about to learn exactly what trespassing cost. The walk back toward the farmhouse felt slow, steady, and purposeful, as though each step cemented the boundary the HOA had ignored for so long. I wasn't rushing to resolve anything. I wasn't eager to negotiate. The point of all this wasn't revenge, it was recognition. For years, the HOA had treated my land as a convenient extension of their community. Today, for the first time, they were being forced to see it for what it truly was, private property with a private owner who had finally stopped tolerating their entitlement. Behind me, the volunteers scrambled, the bus engine still rumbling in anxious idle, and the HOA president remained frozen in the field, trying to figure out how to gain control of a situation no handbook had ever prepared her for. Every minute that passed worked in my favor. Every delay amplified the urgency. The festival they'd poured money and pride into was minutes away from descending into chaos. For once, their logistical crisis wasn't my problem, it was theirs alone. Inside the farmhouse, I sat at the kitchen table and set down the photos I had taken, arranging them in a neat line, tire ruts carved into the dirt, signs ignored, boundaries crossed, equipment unloaded without permission, and guests sprawling across land that wasn't theirs to use. It was more than evidence, it was leverage. Clear, irrefutable leverage that the HOA couldn't talk its way out of. I drafted the invoice on paper, each line calculated not out of spite, but out of fairness. Trespassing fee per bus. Damage to the road. Consequences for unauthorized use of private land for commercial activity. Emergency operational disruption. Storage fees for vehicles left on the property without permission. By the time I finished, the total had reached a number the HOA would consider outrageous, but only because they were used to bullying others without consequences. For what they had done today, the price was more than reasonable. When I stepped outside again, the field was buzzing with frantic motion. The volunteers had stopped pretending things were fine. The drivers leaned against the buses, checking their watches, their eyes darting between the gate and the president who had no answers to give. She paced constantly, her phone pressed to her ear, no doubt calling every board member, every lawyer, every police contact she thought could help. But this wasn't a neighborly disagreement. This wasn't a fine or a warning or a dispute about mailbox colors. This was a matter of property law, and the HOA was undeniably on the wrong side of it. As I approached, the volunteers stepped aside instinctively, forming an unintended path that led directly to the president. Her expression was strained, bent under the weight of failure and embarrassment. Without words, I handed her the invoice. Her hands trembled slightly as she looked at it. Her eyes scanned line after line, the total amount freezing her expression into disbelief. Shock rippled across her face as though the numbers might rearrange themselves if she stared long enough. Behind her, the volunteers watched with silent dread, sensing defeat settling heavily on the field. She turned, searching for alternatives in the faces around her, but there were none. The buses were trapped. The drivers were stuck. The festival timetable was collapsing by the second. Every logical path led to the same conclusion: they had no bargaining power, no legal leverage, and no grounds to argue. The only way those buses were leaving was through the locked gate. And the only person with the key was standing in front of her. The quiet dread that settled over the group was almost tangible. The president lowered the paper, as if hoping the numbers would somehow shrink. But nothing changed. The reality remained: the HOA had made a bold assumption, and now they were paying the price, literally. She stepped away from the group and made several more phone calls, each one more desperate than the last. I didn't need to listen to know what she was hearing in return. No police officer could override property rights in this situation. No lawyer could spin trespassing into innocence. And no board member could conjure a loophole big enough to drive 3 party buses through. Eventually, the calls stopped. The volunteers waited. The drivers shifted anxiously. And the president returned, holding the invoice with the expression of someone who had exhausted every option. There was no negotiation. No argument. No attempt at justification. She simply reached into her bag, withdrew the HOA checkbook, and signed. The humiliation on her face wasn't anger, it was acknowledgement. The HOA had finally encountered a boundary they couldn't bulldoze with paperwork, threats, or community pressure. When she handed me the check, the field fell silent. I pocketed it, turned toward the gate, and walked to the lock with deliberate slowness. Every volunteer and driver watched, their tension rising with every step. When I reached the gate, the metal chain rattled softly as I removed the lock, unfastened the links, and pulled the gate open. The path was clear again. Not because the HOA demanded it. Not because they deserved it. But because they had paid what they owed. The buses started up one by one, their engines rumbling like defeated giants. They rolled down the gravel road slowly, carefully, avoiding the fresh ruts as best they could. The volunteers followed on foot, their heads lowered, their pride cracked. The HOA president was the last to leave, her steps heavy with the knowledge that today's mistake would echo through every future board meeting. When the last bus disappeared beyond the ridge and the dust settled over the empty field, the silence returned, clean, complete, and uninterrupted. The land was mine again. The festival would go on without them. The HOA would return to their manicured streets, shaken and publicly embarrassed. And word of what happened would spread quickly, becoming a cautionary tale whispered throughout the community. For the first time, the HOA understood something they had ignored for years. A boundary, once respected, keeps peace. A boundary, once crossed, demands consequence. And now, they knew I was willing to enforce it. Far beyond the ridge, faint sounds of disarray hinted that the festival was unraveling. Their buses were late. Their schedules were broken. Their planning had fallen apart. But none of that mattered to me. My land was quiet again. My gate was locked. My property line finally meant something to the people who had crossed it without permission. The HOA had sent 3 full-sized party buses onto my land. I had locked the gate and charged them for trespassing. And by the end of it all, only one thing was absolutely certain. They would never, ever, try it again.